Laurie, you review NXT for the WrestleTalk YouTube channel, so I kind of feel like you might be the best person to kind of take on this subject. But like for me, like NXT doesn't feel like it's the hot product that it was, say, this time last year. So what happened to NXT?
I think it's weird because it's like, I think the reason it was the hot product last year is probably the same reason it's not a hot product now. And it's that it went on to USA. And I think like last year around this time, that's when they started putting NXT on USA. The show really went gangbusters in an attempt to beat AEW Dynamite in the ratings. And like they put on, they went up from 1 hour to 2 hours. They managed to fill 2 hours with like non-stop action, which is something that SmackDown struggles to do week on week. They quickly elevated a bunch of guys who had been there for ages, who hadn't really been getting the time of day, who were all brilliant, and gave them really long matches to showcase what they could do. They had really interesting storylines that had sort of been culminating for a while. Like, that first period of NXT was the Undisputed Era winning all the gold, which was like the promise that was made when they first debuted. The promise is in their name. Like it's that it was paying off on all of this old school NXT stuff. So obviously, I think a lot of the people who were watching NXT at the time were like, this is brilliant. I'm getting everything I ever asked for. I'm getting more NXT. I'm getting the storylines developing further. It feels like it's becoming important in WWE's eyes. And, it really is one of the best wrestling shows on TV. The problem is that it sort of quite quickly stopped beating AEW in the ratings and it started losing week on week to AEW, especially in the key demographics. And I think that prompted WWE to think we shouldn't just barrel on making a really good TV show, despite the fact that I would argue that NXT and AEW are very different propositions. Oh, yeah. NXT is still an indie show that is got a bit big for its boots and is, it feels like a very different, more intimate show. It's got almost like it's more similar to Lucha Underground than it is to WWE stuff. Like, you know what I mean? It's like a proper TV show that happens to have wrestling in it, and it, everyone there feels like they part of the story as well, including the crowd. AEW feels like it's trying to compete with Raw and SmackDown, but for some reason WWE and AEW think that NXT and AEW are competing because they're on the same night. So then the key, I think, to why NXT is not quite the show that it once was is because it's on USA and they're trying to get the ratings and they're trying to beat AEW. They are desperately searching for things to do that are going to grab people's attention. And that attention is obviously not the people who already watch NXT. They are looking for people like Charlotte Flair to go down there in the hopes that some of the SmackDown or the Raw audience will transfer over and watch NXT because Charlotte Flair is now the NXT Women's Champion. They're going to send Becky Lynch back for a bit, to do some stuff because that's going to pop the ratings. I won't be surprised if Goldberg turns up there at some point in the future because that's how desperate they are to pop the ratings. But, now it's also led into things like Pat McAfee doing this storyline with Adam Cole because he's got a really huge following. And that's fair enough. But, to someone who is a fan of NXT before it ever got cool, not in the really sort of hipster, I was a fan of that. I like the Arctic Monkeys before anyone even heard their proper songs. This is NXT desperately grasping for mainstream attention. And putting in someone like Pat McAfee might pop the ratings. It might get people interested in watching the show that weren't there before, but I don't think it's going to satisfy the core audience of NXT. And that's the tricky situation WWE is in. They need to build on that core, right?
Yeah. I think that NXT was always the alternative. If you're not enjoying Raw and SmackDown, then it's fine because you can watch NXT. But then AEW's come along and sort of provided an alternative to that alternative. And I think what we've sort of found is that there was a hardcore group of NXT viewers that stuck around, and they were mostly in that over 50 category. They were the WWE lifers that aren't going anywhere, really. They're going to watch no matter what product. WWE could put on any product whatsoever, and that over 50 category will still tune in because that's what they've done for 40 years of their lives is watch this show. So, and the sort of the younger audience seemed to have skewed over towards AEW, so this other alternative, because really they were watching NXT as almost like a protest watch against Raw and SmackDown. And now that protest watch is going to be taken over to AEW. And I think in that, WWE have seen that, oh, actually, do you know what? The problem with NXT isn't that it's a great wrestling show, because it is a great wrestling show. It doesn't feel enough like Raw and SmackDown. So we need to make it feel like Raw and SmackDown now to kind of, and it doesn't feel like the same show that I loved a few years back. And maybe that's just me sort of like, change equals bad, etc. But it's, like, I kind of miss those glory days. Funny enough, I was going through the Observer newsletter for a project I'm working on, and like Brooklyn, I think it was Brooklyn 4, the one that was over WrestleMania weekend, so the Brooklyn show last year. Like every single match, it was like 4.5 stars, 4.5 stars, 5 stars, 5.5 stars. It was just like every single match was just like on untouchable. And I don't think they've had that show this year that felt that untouchable like it did last year.
I think that, well, I mean, there's obviously much wider issues this year. And part of that, but that's part of the reason NXT feels so weird as well, is because they've been having much shorter matches because they don't want people to be interacting for as long periods of time. They've been having much more silly segments because they've had to book around the fact that some people can't be there, some people are elsewhere, who's there on the day. Robert Stone seemingly is always bloody there, and he's had all these weird, wacky segments. But like the weird, wacky segments are a lot safer for them to film and do. So like they really have been leaning a bit heavily on comedy and skits and kind of the goofier aspects of wrestling that fill a wrestling show, sure, and they can fill 2 hours, but they aren't really what people came to NXT for in the first place. And I think, the other thing is that, NXT is a great wrestling show, but because they've gone live and because they're up against AEW and they are counter programming, like Great American Bash, where they were just like, we're going to hot shot both titles onto Keith Lee. And that is the decision. It's like, it didn't feel like there was any build to that particularly. It just felt like that just was a thing that happened. And I think what was so good about NXT last year and for all the years preceding that is that it really felt like there was a roadmap for who's getting a push, what's going to happen. Like it was really noticeable when someone was injured in a storyline where they weren't supposed to be and they had to go out, because you were like, oh, that is such a shame, because there was so much momentum behind them building into something. Like when Ciampa had to go out injured and he was just on the peak of his powers in NXT. Like that roadmap has been missing this year and for a lot of last year, because quite often the decision is made a week before they're going to go live that they got to do something to try and beat AEW. And so it just means that the storyline, rather than just feeling like this really carefully plotted progression, has just been going bill, 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 and it's really hard to keep track of as a viewer. I think they're doing really well now. They're getting back on track with that stuff, like in the build up to TakeOver 30. It does really feel like NXT's found its footing again, and I am absolutely adoring all the stuff between Karrion Kross and Keith Lee. Like, that's great. Pat McAfee, I'm not bothered. But I've been told differently by people in YouTube comments, so we'll see how that pans out.